All right, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rachak Wadash. Double honors to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone who rule very well, very beautifully. Double salutations be unto the Akim. I heard pushing his gospel in truth and in sincerity to the best of their ability, given to them by Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai. Peace, blessings, and salutations be unto the elect scattered abroad. May the election of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Lord willing, fall upon your houses. This is the brother Quana Wath, come back at you, Lord will, with the edifying lesson through the spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Lord will. It is edifying, Lord will. It is straight to the point. And this is ultimately, breaking news. Not too long ago, man, I did a lesson, right, ultimately touching on this bill right here, as you see on the Canadian Constitution Foundation. It says Bill C-9 has passed, and when I did a lesson on it, I want to say a few weeks ago, right, at this point it was still ultimately being drawn up by the Canadian Senate, right, and ultimately going to be pushed for royal assent, right, as they call it, right, basically it being signed, like an executive order, right, like from Donald Trump or whatnot, but in over there in Canada, and it has officially been passed, and we've been telling y'all, right, that for years, starting with the elder apostles of Great Millstone on down, right, we've been telling y'all that the famine of the word, right, and persecution, right, both of those prophecies, right, are they're imminent, right, they're around the corner, and now we see these bills, right, that are ultimately what they call hate bills, right, or as it says right here, Bill C-9 is the combating hate, I was gonna spell it but I already said it, so it is what it is, right, combating hate act, a lot of these, and that's ultimately been, something that's been talked about, and been, introduced in many different countries, but I think, from my knowledge, I think Canada is the only one that actually passed, a bill officially, directed towards combating, what Edom ultimately, deems to be hate, and this is right here is, a major step, right? Because as again, start with the elder apostles on down, right? We've been telling y'all that the famine of the word and persecution of the prophets, those who truly believe in Yahweh, Bashim Shai, the elect, right, are ultimately is around the corner, man, and now it's here, let's get into this bill. I don't want to read too much, because I do have another article. I do want to bring out a few precepts as well, right? It says Bill C-9 is the Combating Hate Act. The bill is the liberal government's response to a rise in hatred. The bill has raised concerns about its impact on civil liberties and religious speech. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians have written to parliamentarians to oppose the bill. This guide is for anyone concerned about Bill C-9. It is legal information. It is not legal advice, right? So, again, it goes into the status, right? It ultimately passed, and it actually passed on June 18th, right? And it's set to be, in effect, right, in July 18th, right? So 1 month, right, from the day that it got passed, right? June 18th, right? July 18th, 1 month, right? It's ultimately going to be, initiated, if you will, right? It says, how will Bill C-9 affect religious expression, right? It says Bill C-9 has removed the good faith religious expression defense from convictions for criminal hate speech. So ultimately removing, saying, oh, I was saying it, in good faith, right? Doing, my religious expression, my freedom of speech, if you will, right? They remove that safety net, from those who ultimately go and preach, those who ultimately are out here, right, speaking these things which they consider to be hate, right? It says it is illegal under section 319, section 1 of the criminal code to publicly incite hatred by communicating statements in any public place that incites hatred against any identifiable group, where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of peace, right? Meaning you're ultimately saying stuff that these people ultimately deem to be offensive, you know, or to incite, you know, some kind of, you know, a person feeling unsafe, you know, or feeling uncomfortable by by what you're saying, right? It says it is also illegal under section 319 number 2 of the criminal code to communicate statements other than in private conversation that willfully promotes hatred against any identified group, and under 319 2.1 to willfully promote anti-Semitism, code worded a little bit, right, by communicating statements other than in private conversation, condoning, denying, or downplaying the, as you see right there, the HC, right? So you're not allowed, and we know who that's ultimately speaking about, right? We're not allowed to speak about, you know, the small hats, right? We're not allowed to speak about, you know, the false, you know, genocide, you know, that they claim ultimately happened to them, you know? We're not allowed to speak on these things, which is something that we do, right? We speak on these things, right? We ultimately, you know, we point out, you know, the lies and deception, right, of Esau, Edom, you know, which he is ultimately, you know, saying that we're not allowed to speak on, man. You know, it says the penalties for these crimes are up to 2 years in prison. Before Bill C-9, if a person charged with public incitement of hatred, willful promotion of hatred, or willful promotion of anti-Semitism could establish that they, in good faith, expressed or attempted to establish by an argument an opinion on a religious subject, or an opinion based on belief in a religious context. So you ultimately say, hey, this is what I believe, right? I believe that this is, you know, the truth, right? Now that's done away with. You can't do that no more, right? It said that would have been a full defense to the charge. This means they would not be convicted. Bill C-9 has removed this defense, putting Canadians at greater risk of charges for religious speech. And again, it goes past, you know, Canada, you know, it goes past, these these other nations that are talking about these bills. Eventually, this is something that's going to be, you know, promoted and established right across the world, right? Because, you know, we understand that, you know, since the prophets came on the scene, right, and started speaking this truth, Esau, you know, has been, you know, he's been listening, he's been watching the videos, right? Isaiah the 13th chapter, right, that they words may go into the gates of the nobles. Matter of fact, let me grab that, you know, in Isaiah 13, I'll start at verse 1. It says, the burden of Babylon, right, which we're in the modern day Babylon, right, the virgin daughter of Babylon, you know, aka, you know, or spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, right? That's here in America, right? It says, the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. Lift ye up a banner upon the high mountain, right? Lifting up this word, this truth, right? Exalt the voice unto them, shake the hand, that they may go into the gates of the nobles, right? So, you know, when we're ultimately going out here and we're rebuking Esau, Edom for, you know, what he has done, his system that he set up, the atrocities that he's committed throughout history, you know, and as well as many other things, right? The gospel, you know, ultimately, you know, has many different facets, right? You're speaking about deliverance, right? You're speaking about comfort, right? We're speaking about rulership and power and these new bodies, right? Also, right, Esau, Edom being taken out of power, you know, going into the Lord ultimately judging him for what he has done. You know, we speak on those things, and Esau doesn't like that. You know, it says, what it talks about that, I think it's in, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's in Job 15 and verse 21, if I'm not mistaken, right? It says right here, it says, a dreadful sound is in his ears, right? This truth coming out, right? You know, the bringing out scripture, because Esau's had his, you know, so-called scholars, right, go and do their research on, you know, the historical, you know, events that have happened in the scriptures, right, such as, you know, coming out of Egypt and you know, the Egyptians, right, being swallowed up in the water when they, you know, when, you know, the Lord ultimately allowed Moses to split the Red Sea, you know, and when they got to the other side, you know, they, you know, brought the waters back together and swallowed up the Egyptians and killed them, right? They see that they're the Egyptian chariots and so on and so forth. They're at the bottom, right, of the Red Sea, right near the Strait of the Gulf of Suez. You know, so it's like they've done their research. They know that the scriptures are true. So when you have the prophets, right, being risen up, right, that's already a sign, right? The prophets being risen up is usually a sign of that, you know, the downfall of that current empire, right? Reading Jeremiah 28:8, right? The prophets that have been before me and before thee of old have prophesied of both war, evil, and pestilence, right? Of kingdoms, you know, so on and so forth, roughly paraphrasing. So this is what we're doing today, and Esau sees that, right? Esau's watching the videos and so on and so forth, and it's what? As it says right here, Job 15:21, a dreadful sound is in his ears, right? It's a dreadful sound. It's like nails on a chalkboard to this devil, man. So he's trying to do everything that he can to stop it, right? Hence the reason why he's, you know, introducing and bringing about these different combating hate acts and different bills and policies that are being established, right, really under the people's noses, man. You know, it says, in prosperity, the destroyer shall come upon him, right? And that, you know, Esau being, you know, rooted out of power, you know, and that's coming upon him quickly, you know, and he sees it. This is why he's speeding things up too, you know. It says, what kind of religious speech will put me at risk of charges? This is difficult to know in advance. The religious speech in question would need to be used to incite hatred in a public place against an identifiable group, to willfully promote hatred against such an identifiable group, or willfully promote anti-Semitism. So ultimately, they're not laying out, you know, what exactly, right, is going to be, you know, considered, you know, hate or whatnot, right? It says this would include inciting hatred against a group on the basis of color, race, religion, national or ethnic origin, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or mental or physical disability. So they're saying, you know, that you speak on these things, you know, then it very well could be considered, right, hate. Right, but what, you know, like what is going to, you know, is there certain things that you say, or are you demeaning them, or, you know, he's not really being, you know, black and white with it, right? He's ultimately trying to be gray, because at the end of the day, he wants to be able to decide whenever he wants to be able to decide, right, if something is considered hate, so he can come after the men of the Lord, man, you know. It says, the Supreme Court of Canada has defined hatred as the most extreme forms of the emotions described by vilification and detestation. The court has said detestation tends to inspire enmity and extreme ill will, which goes beyond mere disdain or dislike. The court has said vilification will seek to abuse, denigrate, or delegitimize a group, render them lawless, dangerous, unworthy, or unacceptable in the eyes of the audience. The court added that this type of speech goes far beyond merely discrediting, humiliation, or offending the victims. The court has not defined anti-Semitism. So there you go, right? So they're not necessarily fully defining it. They're just saying, oh, well, it will cause this, it will cause this, or it will cause that. You know? Esau, again, being fucking deceptive, right? It says, the court has also said that hatred can be identified by looking for hallmarks of hatred, including speech that vilifies the targeted group by blaming its members for the current problems in society. And again, right, as we're going through this list, right, you have to understand that starting with the elder apostles of Great Millstone on down, we do these things, right? The reason, right, and again, right, we go into Isaiah the 24th chapter, right, that tells you the curse hath devoured the earth. Well, who is that talking about? Esau, Edom, right? The earth is defiled and the inhabitants thereof. Well, who's the inhabitants thereof? The wicked. Job 9:24, who's the wicked? Malachi 1:4, Esau, Edom. Who's Esau, Edom? Right? He was given the fatness of the earth. He was given the you know, ability to rule in this, you know, in this current time. Well, who rules? It's the so-called white folks, man. The so-called white man. You know, it's not a color thing, but we understand that most Esau, Edom looks like the so-called white man. You know, vast majority Esau, Edom looks like the so-called white man, right? Showing you that they're the ones in power. Right, and we bring it out that they're the ones that are destroying this earth. You know, they have the ability, because they have the ability to forward the scriptures, right? The law, statutes, commandments in their own kingdom, but they do not. Right, The Bible is the number one bought and produced book in Esau's kingdom, and yet they don't forward the scriptures, right? If they did, then they would Sabbath the land. You know, you wouldn't have 5 and 6 and 7 story buildings, high rises. You wouldn't have that, right? You would have 2-story, and then on the 3rd story, you'd have to have what? A fence around. You know, righteousness will be forward in the earth, but it's not. Wickedness is what is ultimately being, pushed, as you read in Sirach, the 10th chapter, right? Sirach 10 and what is that? Verse 3, right? As the judge is, so is his officers and those that dwell under him, roughly paraphrasing. So because the wicked is in charge, wickedness has been forwarded in the earth, and we ultimately speak on that, right there, showing you that we're not allowed to speak on that. Who is this ultimately going into? Or who is this coming up against? It's coming up against the prophets, right? It says, alleges that members of a group are a powerful menace, right? Esau, Edom, accuses a group of carrying out secret conspiracies to gain global control, or that they are plotting to destroy Western civilization. There you go, man. We speak on these things, man, right? It says, suggests members are illegal or unlawful, such as labeling them liars, cheats, criminals, and thugs, calls people pure evil, equates the targeted group with groups traditionally reviled in society, such as CAs, PDF files, deviant criminals who, on children, which is what, and matter of fact, it just shows you right there, man. Esau is the fucking wicked, because all this information about the EP Steam files and all this other stuff, who's been in the file? Esau Edom is the main culprit in those files, and who has been speaking on them? Us. Great Millstone, starting with the elder apostles of Great Millstone on down, elder bishops, elders, Akim. Right, we've been speaking on these things. We've been pointing out Esau Edom as being the devil that the Bible speaks of. We've been speaking about his wickedness, his hatred for you Israelites, right? And these are all things that we talk about, that they're stating right here that we're not allowed to talk about, right? Again, showing you right then and there, right, who they're coming after, right? It says, describes members of a group as animals or as subhuman, calls into question whether group members qualify as being human beings, or refers to them as horrible creatures who ought not to be allowed to live, and cognizant primates, genetically inferior, lesser beasts, or subhuman filth, right? And we call Esau Edom what? Right? As the scriptures say, right, the basis of men. Scriptures say when when the vilest are in authority, the wicked walk on every side, roughly paraphrasing, man. And that's Esau Edom. That's who is in current rulership, man. These are all things that we cannot, ultimately speak about. Otherwise what? We're deemed as criminals, which right there that's a persecution. Right? This right here opens up the door for persecution, man. And see, this is not just something that's going to ultimately stop, here, in Canada, right? This is ultimately something that's going to be adopted, even here in America, right? Let's grab this. I was looking on end time headlines earlier today. It says, watch, right? Texas police officer warns street preachers they face citation if someone is offended at Alphabet Soup Group Pride Rally, right? It's basically the same thing, right? It's just not on the same level, right? It hasn't passed. This is just them ultimately pushing it, right? It says a viral video from a Fort Worth Pride rally has sparked concerns over free speech protections after a police officer warned Christians, which we know the true Christians are who? Right? The followers of Yahweh Shai, which they wouldn't be called Christians. They would be called what? They'd be called Hamashiachim. The Israelites, right? It says street preachers, they could face citations if their words offend attendants, right? Attendees. The indictment took place on June 27, 2026, so recently, during a TP Fest in Fort Worth, Texas. Members of the street preaching team, led by evangelist Rich Penkowski and including David Grisham, were blocked by police from accessing the public sidewalk upon arrival at the event, As a group engaged with officers, a female officer issued a stark warning about potential enforcement actions tied directly to complaints of offensive speech, meaning they were going to ultimately arrest, whoever it was, right? Those two men, right? Grisham and Pinkoski, and they go through this whole dialogue about, are you really going to write me a ticket? Are you really going to do that? And then you're ultimately told, yeah, they were going to do it. Here's the video, but we're not going to play it, right? It says right here, it says Fort Worth Police Department is committed to protecting constitutional rights of all individuals. And that's not true, right? Now, and Esau's been, slowly but surely, right, under the people's noses, pulling people's rights away, man. Right? They're trying to get rid of the 14th Amendment. Right, the natural born, citizenship, but they're trying to get rid of all of that. So they're pulling these different, the rights away from you people, and you people just don't know. You people aren't paying attention, right? So Esau's moving however he wants, right? It says including the right to free speech and peaceable assembly, while also ensuring public safety and enforcing applicable laws and ordinances. It says right here, it says the female officer told us flat out that we would get a citation if we said anything offensive. So I wanted to clarify with another officer if that was really their position. And it says he told the Christian Post, I was completely surprised that he said that there's a possibility that I can get cited for calling someone a biological male, which is what we do as well. Right? So again, you're starting to see this sentiment really start to spill over even to here in America, right? Which we've been seeing, time and time again, But I want to, ultimately grab, a few scriptures. And this is St. John 15 and verse 18. It says, if the world hate you, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. Right? He's talking about hating Yahushua, right? Yahushua came and told the truth. Right? He was telling the absolute truth, man. And these people hated it. Yahushua, hated him. Right? To the point where they were, they ultimately, were, even our own people, right? The Israelites, right? Speaking about Yahushua, they're saying crucify him, man. Even though he was there for them, for the Israelites, really for the elect, As he said he come not but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel, So again, he was for the Israelites, really starting with the elect, but nonetheless, it's like, come on, Yahushua was for you, and you're gonna turn on him, So how much more, those who he never came for, right? The heathens, right? Esau, Edom in particular, It says, verse 19, it says, if you were of the world would love his own. But because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you, right? And it's because, what did the Apostle Paul say? Do I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? We're telling the people the truth, man. But the Lord only created two genders, right? Male and female. He didn't create all these, and we're going to tell you that. We're going to tell that to the world, man. These people that are fucking delusional, what the Lord say, he gave them up to, strong delusions. That's a straight up strong delusion to believe that you can be a fucking dog or a cat or, all these different, so-called genders. This shit don't even make sense, And because we tell the truth, the world hates us, right? It says, if you were of the world would love his own, but because you're not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you, right? It says, remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also. But all these things will they do unto you for my name's sake, because they know not him that sent me, right? So they came after Yahushua, right, for speaking the truth. And they're going to do the same thing to, the men of the Lord, the prophets, right? Come at the prophets because they're speaking the truth, because we're speaking the truth, right? Which is persecution, And what are they going to do? They're going to snatch up some of the men of the Lord, right? And put them into these FEMA camps, right? The Revelations 2 and verse 10, right? It says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison. Right? Into these prisons, these FEMA camps, these isolation facilities, detention centers, whatever you want to call them, right? It says that ye may be tried, right? Because that's ultimately going to be what? A trial of our faith, right? It says, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. And Lord will, right? If the Lord ultimately deems, that we ultimately have to get snatched up by Esau, and thrown into these FEMA camps, Lord will, the Lord ultimately puts the spirit of endurance upon us, right? To endure whatever it is, man. But that time is coming. That time is around, And see, when that ultimately hits, when the men of the Lord get snatched up, you think the men of the Lord are going to continue to be making videos? You think the men of the Lord are going to continue to try to, those who didn't get snatched up, you think they're going to go out into the highways and byways? No, at that point, it's, the gates of mercy are closed, man. When that ultimately starts to happen, you're ultimately asked out, man. That's going to be the famine of the word, right? As it says right here in Amos 8 and verse 11, right? It says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord Yahweh, by Hashem Yahushua, that I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua. Meaning you're not going to be able to hear this truth, right? Which means you're not going to be able to get it on the internet. You're not going to be able to go down to, your local downtown or whatnot and see the prophets, right? If they be in your area, right? That's not going to happen. There's a series of events that are ultimately going to take place that are going to make that impossible, right? One of them being what? Persecution, right? As well as, Esau, coming at, the different social media platforms and, brothers' faces getting posted on, the news and so on and so forth, right? All these different things are ultimately going to take place, right? That are ultimately make it to where you're not going to get this wisdom, knowledge, and understanding no more, man. Which is the reason why we're constantly preaching, right? To get it now, right? Get it while you can, right? Before it's too late, right? As it says right here, it says, and they shall wander from sea to sea, and from north even to the east. They shall run to and fro to seek the word of Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua, and shall not find it. You're not going to find it. You're not going to find the prophets. You're not going to find this truth on the internet. Esau is going to scrub the internet of these videos. You're just going to be asked out completely. It says, in that day shall the fair virgins and young men faint for thirst. And that's not talking about water, right? It's talking about this living water. Right, talking about that, out of your belly, right, shall flow rivers of living water, right? It's talking about the prophets, meaning this truth, right? They're going to be speaking this truth, right? That fountains of living water, right? The truth, this wisdom, knowledge, understanding. You're not going to be able to get it, man. You're not going to get that spiritual quenching that you need, right, in order to endure these times. That's the time that we're fastly approaching, man. This ain't a joke, right? This is deadly serious, man. And Yahweh Hashem Yahushua is really about to have this devil move hard, man. And again, right, as you read in Revelations 12 and 12, it says right here, it says, therefore rejoice ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. So you best believe Esau gonna move quick on this, man. You best believe Esau is ultimately going to be passing laws like this, combating hate, right? Rapidly, right? And again, everything always starts outside of America and then works its way into America. So you best believe you're gonna see more countries, right, passing hate bills, hate laws, right? And eventually it's gonna hit here in America, man. Because that's the time that we're in. So get this wisdom, knowledge, and understanding before it's too late, man. Let me grab this. It's Isaiah 55 and verse 6. It says, seek ye Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. And let him return unto Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua, and he will have mercy upon him, and to our power, for he will abundantly pardon. So, return to Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua and receive mercy, right? Receive deliverance in the time of persecution, in the time of evil, or perish. Yahweh Shai said it best, man. Unless you repent, you shall all likewise perish. That's the bottom line, man. So with that, Lord wills, edifying, Lord will, straight to the point. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, by Hashem Yahushua, by Hashem Rachakodash, that belongs to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone. Till next time I say shalom.